Just waiting for that, K-Uyn suggested that he follow, and get him something to eat. It's always right to get a heart by way of the stomach. So Choi-han followed the red-haired K-Uyn. The red kitten, after eating, followed K-Uyn without leaving. It rubs its pretty face against his foot. K-Uyn looked down at his feet. Although he was a person who did not like cats, he had to admit that it was very cute. When he looked up, he met Choi-han's judgmental gaze. At this point, he can't ignore them even if he want to. He sat down and stroked the kitten, said a few words and then said goodbye to it. This red cat seems to be happy, but only at the urging of the gray cat did it leave. Cal breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that must have been through Choi-han's dignity assessment. They went to K-Uyn's house. Even though he tried to act like he didn't notice, Choi-han kept staring at him, making him feel unnatural. He was still evaluating to see if K-Uyn was an opponent he needed to kill. The timid master call came out, breaking the awkward atmosphere between them. It turned out to be the voice of the two gatekeepers. K-Uyn was helpless. He really didn't understand why they called him, but they were so scared that they stuttered. He entered the mansion with Choi-han. Ron was at the door to welcome him home. Ron looked at Choi-han, Choi-han looked at Ron again. K-Uyn had an illusion like there was a spark between them. He asked Choi-han to follow him. Ron graciously asked K-Uyn what happened in the end, and if he needed him to take care of this strange visitor. K-Uyn refused and led Choi-han upstairs. A young blonde man appeared. It was the deputy butler Hans who was in charge of him. He was quite surprised that K-Uyn came back this time even though he had been drinking. K-Uyn raised the bottle of wine, causing Hans to scream and then instinctively cringe because he thought K-Uyn was going to throw it at him. Turns out K-Uyn just wanted to give it to him to put it away. K-Uyn led Choi-han to the kitchen, where there was someone he needed to see: Beecrox, son of old assassin Ron. Like his father, he is also a scary person. Look at the way he cooks with his face and hands, you'll understand. Choi-han needed to meet this person because when Beecrox saw Choi-han's skill when he knocked out K-Uyn, he will be impressed and decide to follow him. To K-Uyn, this was like killing two birds with one stone. Because if he can get him to leave with Choi-han, his father will follow too. K-Uyn smiled at the plan he came up with, then ordered Beecrox to cook something for Choi-han to eat. Beecrox looks displeased, still holding a knife in hand, looking at K-Uyn affectionately as if he was about to kill him. But K-Uyn still resolutely ordered him. This time Beecrox had no complaint, respectfully obeyed and got to work. K-Uyn thought to himself that this situation was amazing. Beecrox, Choi-han and Ron, all three of them are now linked. He's probably starting to feel hungry because he's so happy. So instead of cooking one portion for Choi-han, Beecrox now has to cook another one for him. Remembering yesterday's steak, K-Uyn casually praised his talent, acknowledging him as a talented chef. After hearing that, Beecrox's face looked like he wanted to ask K-Uyn, did he take the wrong medicine today? Otherwise, why was he suddenly so soft-spoken? After ordering, K-Uyn left the kitchen. At this time, the deputy butler Hans followed him and asked how to treat Choi-han. K-Uyn instructed to treat Choi-han well. Now that Choi-han, Ron and Beecrox have met, your work for today is done. If that's still not enough, he'll make Choi-han hit someone and show Beecrox. He told Hans to bring it to his room when the food was ready, and then he left. Hans told everything that happened to Count de Ruth, K-Uyn's father. From his visit to the Flynn Merchant Guild's illegal tea house, to bringing a stranger home, including the fact that he drank alcohol this time but was sober when he got home. Hans asked for instructions to see if he needed more followers of K-Uyn, but Count de Ruth refused. He thinks that, as long as he stays in this city, everything he does is under his control. So Hans just needs to keep observing and reporting to him as usual on what he's done. Count de Ruth was a little pensive. He realized that his goddamn son had changed. K-Uyn was different from usual, not because he suddenly became stronger and smarter. Even his actions were unusual. After thinking for a while, the Count decided to let Hans investigate information about Flynn's illegitimate child. He took the order and went out. In the room, the Earl thought, what changed here was not only K-Uyn, but the atmosphere on the continent also became more dangerous. The Hennedis family protected their property and increased it little by little. The motto here is no need to be recorded in history. Just hope to have a peaceful and happy life. Maybe it's time for him to reinforce the wall. While the Earl was busy worrying about national affairs, K-Uyn was struggling to deal with the evil old man Ron. His face turned pale, he wasn't feeling well at all, and Ron was carrying a cup of lemon tea over a branch which made his pain worse. Ron showed concern, saying that because he slept so well that he didn't dare to wake him up. K-Uyn had nothing to say. It's a waste of talent if this old man doesn't act. He suddenly noticed a wound on Ron's neck. Ron replied vaguely that it was because the cat scratched him, but it was actually because he wanted to beat the main character. Who would have thought he'd be hit back? K-Uyn knew that but didn't expose his lie. He finished the cup of tea the old man brought over, then got up and went out. He told Ron not to worry about him because someone else would take care of everything outside. As soon as he pushed the door to go out, his eyes were met with the main character's face, making him startled, instinctively slamming the door. What a big surprise. So he started to blame Ron. The old man didn't expect that K-Uyn would be surprised like that and explained that before he could say it, K-Uyn had already opened the door. He asked Choi-Han to wait in the room, but he insisted to meet K-Uyn and wait outside. After calming down his emotions, K-Uyn opened the door. He wanted to know what Choi-Han was here for. He replied that he wanted to thank him. K-Uyn thought that was really ridiculous. So he refused and asked if he had anything else to ask of him. Was hit the nail on the head. Choi-Han began to confess. K-Uyn knew that it was definitely related to Harris Village. It's best if he doesn't get involved in this case. K-Uyn decided to leave everything to Hans. He didn't forget to advertise that Hans is a talented deputy manager who can definitely help Choi-Han. In addition, K-Uyn also ordered Ron to do his best to help Choi-Han. K-Uyn left Choi-Han to Ron, and he was busy getting more money because he was going to need a lot of it today. At that moment, Ron felt that things were starting to get interesting. The brave dog doesn't like sour food and always hates it but still drinks the cup of tea he prepared. Ron turned to evaluate Choi-Han. Choi-Han exudes the smell of blood, but pretending to be pure, the typical lowly crook in his eyes. Ron led the way for Choi-Han. Choi-Han briefly followed K-Uyn's back, then turned to follow Ron. As planned yesterday, K-Uyn went to the cursed tree again today with a sack full of bread on his shoulder. He continued to pour all that bread into the hole under the tree. This time, a woman's voice came out from there. "More, give me more." This is the voice of the woman mentioned in the novel. The nun was starved to death. He suddenly remembered what his father told him. He didn't know what he was talking about, but he told him to drop by the library tonight. So he had to return before dinner. While his goal for today was to satisfy the tree's appetite by at least half of it. Time is running out, he has to be faster. He came down from the top of the hill to continue getting more bread. He saw 2 kids yesterday. There are some scars on their dirty faces. He made a face and clicked his tongue and left. K-Uyn entered the area where many bakeries were gathered in the market. Today he got bread from the shop yesterday, so he didn't have to wait for them to prepare. He had to find another shop. At this moment, a lady took the initiative to start a conversation and offer her bakery. Of course he took all the bread from that lady. Still the same old habit, he threw her a gold coin. Immediately, a smile appeared on the corner of the middle-aged woman's mouth. She quickly went inside the store and took out a huge sack of bread. Bread has been packed for him. What a businesswoman. Before he was about to leave, she didn't forget to offer for the next time. Seeing the great bargain in front of his eyes, another bakery owner also began to try his best to offer K-Uyn. For someone who needed bread more than gold like K-Uyn, of course he wouldn't refuse. So tomorrow he can stop by 3 bakeries to get bread. K-Uyn felt satisfied when the work went smoothly. However, K-Uyn didn't notice that, in a nearby alley, Beacrox was watching his every single move. He really doesn't understand what K-Uyn's doing here. Ron Beacrox's father told him that K-Uyn was an interesting person. He didn't really care, but now, the more he looked at K-Uyn, the more he realized that his father was right. Following K-Uyn made him feel as interesting as following the black-haired boy Choi-Han. This isn't bread. This isn't. So? K-Uyn snorted at the little girl who was receiving the medicinal herbs while stammering this is not bread and then headed towards the man-eating tree. But that boy stopped him. Don't die, okay? K-Uyn just walked past the boy. K-Uyn, no, it's Kim Roxu who really is an unremarkable orphan. That's why he sympathizes with the boy's pitifulness. Need a reason to sympathize with the pitiful people? No reason for sympathy. He also misunderstood that saying, but as he grew older, he finally understood. Things that come from the heart do not need the intervention of the mind. K-Uyn hated seeing children suffer. But even so, he had no intention of comforting or protecting them. He grimaced and said to the girl who was shyly approaching and the boy beside her, "I won't die." After hearing that, 2 kids didn't follow him anymore. This tree must have gotten used to being taken care of by him, so as soon as it saw him, it started asking for food. Well, eating it, K-Uyn poured bread into this bottomless mouth again. He seemed to be able to feel the darkness fade away. The money he spent wasn't in vain. After finishing his work, K-Uyn turned back and realized that the troublesome duo from earlier had disappeared, and he couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. It's nice to not have to see their injured faces. But this time, instead of seeing 2 kids, he saw 2 cats. Silver fur with golden eyes and red fur with golden eyes, which he gave chicken breast last night,